Why was she the only one who heard it differently? The announcement was calm, steady, professional, but Sarah knew the quiet crack beneath the captain's voice, a fracture only another pilot would recognize. She had heard it before in simulators, in debriefings, in accident recordings. And now, somewhere over the Atlantic, she was hearing it again, live. 4 hours into the red-eye from New York to London, Seat 12F had been nothing more than a cramped cocoon where she tried to forget her own restlessness. She had leaned against the cool window glass, dozing in and out, until the turbulence hit like a fist. A violent lurch left her water bottle rolling down the aisle, and a gasp rippled through the cabin like a single, frightened breath shared by nearly 300 souls. The 777 shuddered. Lightning illuminated the sky, and for a moment, Sarah's reflection in the window stared back at her, eyes wide, jaw tight, heart hammering. A passenger, yes, but also something else. A pilot who had spent 15 years inside cockpits that smelled of coffee and burnt wires, hearing the language of machines the way others heard music. This turbulence, it wasn't normal. She sat upright, pressing her palms into the armrests. Passengers around her shifted nervously, whispering. The lights overhead flickered, then dimmed into amber gloom. A flight attendant stumbled past, barely catching herself. Their eyes met. Sarah saw something there that froze her pulse. Not calm, not reassurance. Panic barely held back. And then came the words. "Ladies and this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some technical difficulties and severe weather conditions. As a precautionary measure." A pause too long, too heavy. "We need to ask if there are any qualified pilots among our passengers. If you are a licensed pilot, please press your call button immediately." The cabin fell silent. It was the silence of disbelief first, then fear. People looked at one another, waiting for someone else to act, to laugh, to dismiss it as routine. But no one did. No one moved, except Sarah. Her hand hovered over the call button. 1,000 thoughts crashed into one another: her current job at NetJets, her years at United Airlines, her countless hours logged in the 777. She had wanted anonymity tonight, just another face among strangers crossing the Atlantic in darkness. But now the storm outside wasn't the only storm raging. This was a choice, a burden, a summons. And she pressed it. The attendant was there almost instantly, urgency sharpening every step. Her name tag read Maria. She leaned in close, her voice trembling as the aircraft jolted again. "Are you a pilot?" Sarah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Captain Sarah, former United Airlines, type-rated on this aircraft. What's the situation?" Maria's lips parted, but her eyes answered first, raw fear. The captain collapsed. 20 minutes ago. The first officer is alone. He asked for help. Please come with me." Sarah unbuckled, ignoring the murmurs rising from passengers as she stood. The aisle seemed narrower than ever as she walked toward the front. Every bump of turbulence shoved her sideways. Every whisper behind her asked questions she dared not answer. Are we going to crash? Why do they need another pilot? At the reinforced cockpit door, Maria turned back. Tears trembled in her eyes. "God help us," she whispered and opened the door. The cockpit was chaos in red and amber. Warning lights flashed, chimes pulsed, and the storm beyond the windscreen lit up in violent strobes. The first officer, young, pale, drenched in sweat, looked up as though salvation had just entered. "Thank God, I'm Jim Mitchell. Captain collapsed during the storm entry. Paramedic passenger is with him, looks like a heart attack. I've been hand-flying for nearly an hour. Autopilot won't hold. Systems are failing." Sarah slid into the left seat, her old seat, the one that had once defined her. The yoke was alive under her hands, the 777 thrashing like a wounded animal. She scanned the panel in rapid sweeps. Engine parameters unstable. Weather radar painted only red and magenta, solid walls of storm. Autopilot disengaged. Fuel burn climbing too fast. "How long have you been hand-flying?" she asked. 47 minutes, Jim said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. She felt it immediately, the muscle memory, the rhythm, the connection. She had flown thousands of hours, but nothing ever felt as intimate as this. A machine trying to survive, and her hands the only translation between chaos and order. "We're 800 miles east of Newfoundland," she murmured, her eyes darting across instruments. "Fuel. 17,000 left. At this rate, maybe 3.5 hours." London was 4 hours away. America was almost the same, neither an option. The math didn't lie. "Get on with Gander. Declare captain incapacitated, severe weather, fuel concern. Request nearest divert. Medical advisory frequency for." Jim obeyed, relief in having someone shoulder the weight. She pulled the aircraft's nose a fraction, feeling the strain ease then return, like wrestling a storm itself. Behind her, Maria clutched the doorway, voice shaking. "The paramedic says his vitals are weak. He's unconscious. It was a heart attack." Sarah's jaw tightened. Was a veteran, 20,000 hours. If this storm had broken him, it spoke of its brutality. "We're diverting," she said flatly. Gander's voice crackled through the static. "Nearest suitable Keflavik, Iceland, 2.5 hours. Weather overcast, light rain, VFR." Sarah exhaled slowly. Safety. Hope. A speck of land in the endless ocean. But 2.5 hours was an eternity if the engines kept faltering. "Tell them we're taking Keflavik," she ordered. Her fingers danced across the flight computer, programming the new course even as the aircraft bucked under another violent updraft. Passengers screamed behind the cockpit wall. Metal groaned. A coffee pot shattered somewhere in the galley. Then the alarm. "Engine 2, anti-ice failure." Sarah's blood went cold. Ice, the silent killer of jet engines, was now creeping where it didn't belong. The right engine was exposed, vulnerable. She looked at Jim. His eyes reflected her dread. "Monitor engine 2. Any fluctuations, temperature, pressure. We reduce power immediately." A knock at the cockpit door. Maria opened it, letting in a man in his 50s, clutching the for balance. His suit was wrinkled, tie undone, but his eyes were steady. "David Park," he said quickly. "Private pilot, 800 hours. I heard you needed help." Sarah studied him, not airline trained, not type-rated, but calm, and calm was currency. "You know systems?" she asked. "I'm an electrical engineer. I understand redundancies. I can help." She nodded once. "Not here. Work with the cabin crew. Keep passengers calm. If this gets worse, we'll need order back there." David didn't argue. He just nodded and left. Another downdraft slammed them, dropping the jet 1,000 feet. Negative G pinned Sarah against her harness. Passengers shrieked. Oxygen masks trembled. The hull groaned. "Inspection," she gasped. "As soon as it calms, cabin crew checks for damage, stress fractures." Jim's hands shook as he heard commands. His forehead glistened with sweat. "Gander reports smoother conditions in 30 minutes, he said. 30 minutes, an eternity, but hope. Then the spike. Engine 2's temperature jumped 927 C, then fell, like a heart skipping beats. Sarah had seen it before, the beginning of death. "Reduced to 70%, she ordered. "Now." The aircraft yawed left, power uneven. She corrected with rudder, hands steady despite the storm clawing at them. Flying with reduced power was like sprinting on one leg. Possible, but dangerous. Maria returned pale. "Passengers are panicking. Some say they'll rush the cockpit if we don't tell them the truth." Sarah's heart sank. Fear spreads faster than fire in the air, and if they lost control of the cabin, it was over. "Get me the mic." Her fingers closed around the PA switch. Her voice filled the cabin, measured, calm, honest. "This is Captain Sarah. I am a qualified airline captain. Our original captain suffered a medical emergency. I am flying this aircraft with First Officer Mitchell. We are diverting to Iceland. The aircraft is designed for these conditions. We have backup systems for every critical function. We need your cooperation. Stay seated. Trust us. We will get you home." Silence. Then slowly the tension ebbed. Conversations hushed. The storm outside was still violent, but inside, a fragile calm returned. Jim exhaled, almost a laugh. That worked. Sarah didn't smile. Her eyes were back on Engine 2, watching, waiting. It was stable for now. Autopilot re-engaged. For the first time in hours, the yoke stilled under her hands, a fragile truce between machine and storm. But she knew. The worst was not behind them. The engine was dying, and 2 hours of ocean still lay between survival and disaster. How long could a machine keep limping before it simply gave up? Sarah had asked herself versions of that question in simulators, in classrooms, in training that always ended with someone saying, "Good work, reset." But here, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic, there was no reset, no instructor, no safety net, just metal, ice, and nearly 300 souls staring unknowingly at the edge. The storm outside softened to a chop, but it was deceptive, like a predator circling rather than attacking. Lightning flashes were fewer now, yet the still trembled under gusts that rattled trays, whispered through panels, and reminded Sarah that the air itself was hostile tonight. "Engine 2 holding for now," Jim muttered. His eyes didn't leave the flickering numbers. Exhaust gas temperature 910. Pressure fluctuations minor, but there. He read them aloud the way a nurse reads vitals in a trauma ward, each number a prayer that the patient clings to life. Sarah nodded, adjusting trim. "Stay with it. If it climbs past 940, we bring it back again." The cockpit smelled of hot circuits and human fear. Sweat dripped from Jim's forehead, though the air was cold. His breathing came fast. She remembered when she was his age, hand flying through her first emergencies, learning how much a body could shake while the voice remained calm. Behind them, the cabin was alive with a different kind of struggle. Muffled voices, crying children, footsteps rushing too fast. The storm of human fear was harder to control than weather. And then David Park appeared again at the cockpit door, gripping the frame for balance. "Captain, we have injuries." His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. 6 passengers cut and bruised, one with a swollen wrist. Flight attendants are working, but people know something's wrong. They're asking questions. Sarah kept her eyes on the horizon line flickering on her display. "Tell them this, weather diversion, medical precaution. That's the truth they need, not more, not less." David hesitated, then nodded. But before he turned, he added quietly, "There are some who don't believe it. They're starting to demand answers." Her stomach clenched. Truth was always a balance in the air. Too much honesty became chaos. Too little, and fear invented its own lies. "David, work with Maria. Keep them calm, that's your mission." He met her gaze, gave a single sharp nod, and vanished into the dim cabin. Sarah adjusted the flight computer, rerouting toward Iceland. Her hands were steady, but inside she felt the familiar war between the mask of command and the tremor of doubt. She was Oceanic's captain. This wasn't her responsibility. She was supposed to be anonymous tonight, forgotten in seat 12F, but fate had no respect for boundaries. Gander confirms Keflavik weather VFR. Winds 270 at 15. Overcast 800 feet, Jim reported. His voice cracked and he cleared his throat. "Good enough," Sarah replied. "ILS 19, let's set it." He typed frequencies into the nav radios, his hands trembling so much he pressed wrong keys twice. She glanced at him. He looked like a man stretched beyond his years. "You're doing fine," she said softly. His eyes flicked to hers, a brief flash of gratitude. Sometimes the only thing holding a crew together was a word at the right moment. The aircraft jolted again, not violent, but enough to shake the overhead bins. Sarah imagined the faces behind the door, mothers clutching children, businessmen whispering, strangers holding hands they'd never held before. Emergencies made families of anyone. Engine 2 rising, Jim said suddenly. 9:30 still climbing. Her pulse spiked. Reduced to 60%, do it now. He pulled the lever back and the aircraft lurched sideways. Sarah corrected with rudder, her body moving like it had 1,000 times before in simulators, but this was no simulation. This was survival in real time. At 60% power, the engine whined in protest, unbalanced, unnatural. The entire fuselage vibrated with the effort of one heart beating too hard while the other faltered. "We can't hold this forever," Jim whispered. "We don't need forever," Sarah replied. "We need 2 hours." But inside she wondered, did they even have that? Maria slipped in, her face pale but her voice professional. "Cabin secure, injuries stable, but people know something's wrong. Captain, they're scared." Sarah turned briefly, locking eyes with the attendant. "Good, fear keeps them seated. Panic is what kills. Keep it fear, not panic." Maria nodded slowly, understanding more than Sarah expected. Then she left. For 10 long minutes, silence held in the cockpit. Only instruments, the storm's fatting whispers, and the steady hiss of airflow across aluminum wings. Then David's voice again, quiet at the door. "There's a group in the center cabin. 8, maybe 10. They're angry, talking about rushing forward. Maria can't hold them much longer." Sarah's chest tightened. This was the scenario every hijack-era captain dreaded. Not terrorism this time, but fear. Fear that could burst like fire through the narrow tube of a cabin. She didn't hesitate. She reached for the PA. Her voice filled the plane, steady as iron despite the weight pressing her chest. "Ladies, and this is Captain Sarah. I was a passenger tonight like you, but I am also a trained airline captain. I am flying this aircraft now with First Officer Mitchell. Here is the truth. Our original captain suffered a medical emergency. We are diverting to Iceland where excellent facilities are waiting. This aircraft is designed to fly safely even under stress. And I need you with me. Stay calm. Stay seated. This is how we bring everyone home." Silence followed, the kind of silence that carries decision. Then, slowly, David raised his thumb in the doorway. The tension was easing. People were listening. Jim exhaled, shoulders slumping. "You just saved us twice, once in the cockpit, once back there." Sarah didn't reply. Her eyes were locked again on the engine display. Numbers wavering, climbing. 940, 942, stabilizing, just below the fatal line. "Hold it there," she whispered, though no machine listens to whispers. For an hour they fought like that. The storm weakening, the cabin quieting, the engine slowly unraveling with every mile. Sarah's arms ached, her back screamed, but she held the machine steady. The autopilot could handle part of it now, but she didn't dare trust it completely. Fuel numbers ticked down. 3,400 pounds projected on arrival, barely legal, barely safe, but enough if nothing else failed. Behind them the cabin settled into uneasy calm. An infant cried, then quieted. Passengers murmured prayers. The crew walked softly between rows, distributing blankets, bandages, whispers of reassurance. And then through the window at last, a glow, a faint shimmer on the horizon, Iceland. Sarah felt her throat tighten. They weren't safe, not yet, but land was a promise. A runway was a hope. "Descend to 240, Reykjavik control ordered through the static." Sarah guided the nose down, the engines groaning as the heavy jet surrendered altitude. Clouds swallowed them, then spit them into gray mist. Rain streaked across the glass. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing," she announced, her voice calm though her heartbeat thrashed. Maria acknowledged, her voice echoing faintly through the cabin speakers. Clicked. Bags were shoved under seats. Passengers braced. Jim ran checklists, his voice mechanical as though reciting ritual prayers. Flaps set. Gear armed. Systems checked. Engine 2 still bleeding heat, still whispering of betrayal. Through the mist the approach lights shimmered, a string of pearls across the ocean night. "Runway in sight," Sarah said softly. For a moment emotion cracked through her iron mask. A runway, salvation. But fate wasn't finished. At 400 feet, just as the runway aligned beneath them, Engine 2 shuddered violently. Warning alarms screamed. Red lights flared. "Engine failure," Jim shouted. The right engine's numbers collapsed, power, pressure, temperature all zero. Dead. The aircraft yawed hard, threatening to roll. Sarah gripped the yoke, feet slamming rudder, muscles screaming as she forced the wounded jet back on path. "Single engine approach," she barked. "We continue." The runway lights rushed toward them. One engine alive. One engine dead. 300 lives balanced on her hands. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20. The wheels slammed into asphalt. The nose dropped. Reverse thrust roared from the living engine. Brakes screamed. The jet slowed until mercifully it crawled. They were down, alive. Fire trucks chased them down the runway, lights blazing. Ambulances waited. The storm, the fear, the fight behind them now. Sarah exhaled for the first time in 3 hours. Her body trembled with the release of everything she had held in silence. Behind her, passengers cried, not in fear now, but in relief. And in the cockpit, Jim whispered, his voice raw. "You just saved us all. What happens after you survive? People think it ends at the runway, that the wheels touch down, the brakes screech, and safety is restored. But for Sarah, survival was only the beginning. The rolled to a crawl, fire trucks packing them like sentinels, red and blue lights reflecting off the wet tarmac. The rain fell in sheets, silver under the floodlights of Keflavik. Passengers pressed against windows, staring at emergency vehicles, realizing the ordeal was not a nightmare, but something they would recount for the rest of their lives. "Parking brake set," Sarah announced, her voice flat with fatigue. Her hands trembled as she released the yoke, the first time in hours her body allowed itself to sag. Jim read the checklist, his voice low, almost robotic. Engines 1 shut down, Engine 2 already dead, APU started, external power connected. He swallowed hard, then whispered, "All systems secure." Through the rain-smeared cockpit windows, Sarah watched the ambulance rush forward, lights flashing, for Captain, the man who had collapsed 20 minutes before she arrived in the seat. He hadn't seen the landing, hadn't heard the wheels kiss asphalt. His fate was still uncertain. "Ladies and," she spoke into the intercom, her voice soft but steady, "we have landed safely in Keflavik, Iceland. Please remain seated while emergency crews assess our situation. Thank you for your patience and your courage." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Not panic now, relief, exhaustion, quiet tears. The jet bridge connected with a hollow thud. Maria appeared at the cockpit door, her hair damp, her expression drawn but grateful. "Captain, paramedics are coming aboard. Captain needs immediate evacuation. Injured passengers too." Sarah nodded. "Coordinate with them, keep the cabin seated until they're ready. Order matters now." The door opened. Cold air flooded in. A team of paramedics in neon vests moved swiftly, wheeling a stretcher, their movements practiced but urgent. Lay pale and motionless as they strapped him in, oxygen mask pressed to his face. A paramedic leaned to Maria. "Stable but critical. We'll take him straight to Reykjavik University Hospital." Sarah's chest ached watching him disappear down the jet bridge. She had known him only in passing, a veteran with decades of command. But now he was reduced to frailty, a reminder that even giants fall. She rose slowly, her legs heavy, her body trembling with delayed adrenaline. The cockpit, once a furnace of alarm and chaos, now felt eerily silent. Instruments blank, Engine 2 frozen at zeros. The machine that had tried to betray them lay quiet, its secrets still hidden. "Captain," a voice cut in. She turned. A tall man in uniform stood at the doorway, rain dripping from his shoulders. His eyes were sharp, assessing. "I'm Captain, Icelandic Aviation Authority. We need to debrief you while the details are fresh." Sarah nodded, too tired to protest. Duty didn't end when the aircraft stopped. The terminal buzzed with emergency crews, airline representatives, and curious passengers craning necks for a glimpse of the cockpit heroine. Sarah avoided their eyes, keeping her stride even professional. Applause broke out spontaneously in the terminal as she passed. It hit her like a wave, unexpected, unwanted. She kept her gaze down. Applause belonged to sports arenas, not survival. In a small conference room, Sarah sat opposite, Jim beside her. A video screen connected them to Oceanic Airlines Operations Center in New York. The face of Thomas Wayne, director of flight operations, appeared, hair tousled, tie loose. "Captain," he began, "first, thank you. Your actions tonight prevented a disaster." Sarah gave a small nod but didn't bask in praise. She learned long ago that aviation wasn't about heroics. It was about margins, decisions, and the refusal to quit. Leaned forward, "Walk me through it, from the moment you entered the cockpit." Sarah inhaled, organizing memory into precision. Storm penetration, autopilot disengaged, captain incapacitated, First Officer Mitchell hand flying 47 minutes, engines unstable, fuel burn high, declared pan with Gander, diverted to Keflavik. Jim added, engine 2 anti-ice system failed, exhaust gas temp climbing, reduced power twice, engine finally seized at 400 feet on final approach. Scribbled notes, passenger management. Sarah hesitated. This part was less mechanical, more human. Fear spread. A group considered storming the cockpit. I addressed them directly. Truth, reassurance, it calmed them. On the video screen, Wayne leaned closer. "That was decisive. You prevented chaos." Sarah shook her head. "Passengers aren't obstacles. They're part of the equation. If they lose trust, you lose the flight. Tonight, trust saved us as much as ailerons." His eyes narrowed, impressed. He wrote more. Then, "Is there anything you'd have done differently?" The question stabbed her. Second-guessing was dangerous, but honesty mattered. She swallowed. "Maybe I should declared full emergency sooner. It might have given priority routing faster. But with the information at hand, I believe our decisions were sound." Silence. Rain hammered the windows. Finally closed his folder. "Captain, your testimony will be critical. Investigators need every detail." Sarah leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She wanted a bed, darkness, silence, but this was only the start. Hours later, in a sterile hotel room, Sarah collapsed onto the bed. Her phone buzzed with messages, calls, notifications. Somehow, news had already spread. Off-duty pilot saves 287 lives. Headlines pinged across the globe. She stared at the glowing screen, the words blurring. Off-duty pilot, hero, saved. But she didn't feel like a hero. She felt hollow, shaken, grateful, guilty for feeling proud. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Jim, pale and tired, holding 2 cups of cheap hotel coffee. "You seen the news?" he asked. "Too much of it," she replied. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring into the cup. "They'll want interviews. CNN, BBC, all of them. But I don't want to be on TV. I just want to fly." Sarah nodded slowly. "Me too, but sometimes the story chooses you." He looked at her, eyes bloodshot but sincere. "You were incredible tonight. I wouldn't have made it without you." She let the words settle, heavy and awkward. She wasn't used to praise. She was used to procedure, checklists, criticism. But tonight had been different. Tonight, there had been no script. Another knock. David Park stood at the door, shoulders slouched but eyes alive. "Sorry to intrude, just wanted to say thank you from all of us." He hesitated, then added, "Passengers are drafting a letter to Oceanic to make sure they know what you did." Sarah shook her head. "Unnecessary, we just did what had to be done." David smiled faintly. "That's what makes it extraordinary." When he left, Sarah leaned against the doorframe, staring into the quiet hallway. She thought of her seat in row 12, the life she'd almost stayed hidden in. She thought of the moment she pressed the call button. It would have been easier not to. But sometimes dignity doesn't ask, it acts. As she lay back down, her phone buzzed again. A message from her scheduler at NetJets. Saw the news, call when you can. The world was already moving. Her name no longer belonged only to her. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, one truth pulsed through her mind. This wasn't over. The storm had ended, but the investigation was only beginning. How do you measure the distance between survival and consequence? For Sarah, it was only a matter of hours. One moment she was in the cockpit, muscles burning, forcing a wounded jet onto Icelandic asphalt. The next, she was walking into a cavernous hangar at Keflavik Airport, floodlit, humming with investigators, engineers, and mechanics swarming over the 777 like surgeons dissecting a patient who had almost died. The storm had ended, the flight was safe, but now came the questions. "Captain," called a voice. She turned. A tall woman in a reflective vest approached, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp behind rain-streaked glasses. "Captain, Icelandic Transportation Safety Board. Thank you for coming so quickly. We need your account." Sarah gave a tired nod. Her body still felt the phantom tremors of turbulence, her wrists aching from hours of fighting the yoke. But duty didn't wait for rest. They led her to the engine. It sat on a stand, its metallic belly exposed, cowling removed. Even at a distance Sarah saw the damage, compressor blades warped, edges chewed and frosted white with ice scarring. Close up, it looked like a heart that had been forced to beat until it tore itself apart. "Massive ice ingestion," explained, gesturing to the blades. "Your decision to reduce power likely saved the aircraft. If you'd kept engine 2 at full thrust," she tapped the metal with her pen. "Catastrophic failure, shrapnel through the fuselage. You wouldn't have made it here." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much in the air, but seeing it confirmed, steel torn and blistered, made her throat dry. "So it was just the storm?" she asked. Hesitated. "That's what we're trying to determine." On a nearby table, photographs spread across a laptop screen. Graphs of temperatures, icing rates, electromagnetic anomalies. Sarah studied them, her pilot's mind automatically parsing patterns. "This wasn't standard icing," said. "Our meteorologists believe the storm produced conditions far beyond certification standards. Supercooled droplets, high concentrations, rapid temperature shifts. In plain terms, no aircraft system was designed for this." Sarah frowned. "But storms like that, how common are they?" A new voice answered from behind. "More common than you'd like to believe." Sarah turned. A woman in her 40s, sharp-featured, carrying herself with quiet authority, stepped forward. "Dr. Foster, National Weather Service, U.S. I specialize in aviation meteorology." Sarah shook her hand. It was cold, firm. Dr. Foster opened a tablet, swiping through storm data. "The system you penetrated was part of a larger front we've been tracking, unusual in intensity. Our models show increasing frequency of these anomalies, linked to climate shifts over the North Atlantic. In other words," she looked Sarah in the eye, "this isn't a one-off." The words sank heavy. Sarah had spent her career training for known risks, but this, storms rewriting the rules, felt like stepping into a new kind of war. The Icelandic authority from the night before joined them, papers in hand. "Captain, your testimony will help us establish emergency advisories. Other crews need to know how you managed the failure." Sarah glanced at the engine again. The blades jagged the chamber. It looked like it had fought until its last breath. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Everything," said simply. For the next 2 hours, Sarah sat in a glass-walled office while investigators questioned her with forensic precision. She described every second: the turbulence onset, The sound of straining engines, the anti-ice failure, the temperature spikes, her decision to reduce thrust. They noted every word, cross-checking against flight data and voice recorder logs. Your instinct to reduce power, Dr. Foster remarked, wasn't in the checklist. Why did you make that call? Sarah exhaled. Experience. Smaller jets years ago. I'd seen engines overheat in icing before. I knew pushing them only accelerates failure. Sometimes instinct is all you have. The room fell silent, pens scratched across paper. A young investigator finally spoke. That instinct may be the difference between survival and disaster. Other crews need to hear it. The weight pressed heavier on her shoulders. Her decision, one she had made in seconds with adrenaline clawing her, was now being carved into procedure. And if she was wrong, if her instinct was misread, it wouldn't just be her burden. It could ripple across the entire industry. After the debrief, Sarah stepped outside the hangar. The Icelandic night air was cold, crisp, sharp with salt from the sea. Above, streaks of green shimmered, the northern lights. It was surreal, almost cruel, that nature could be both beauty and menace within the same sky. David Park was waiting near the exit, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. He gave her a small, hesitant smile. How did it go? Sarah shrugged. Like a courtroom, only lives depend on the verdict. David nodded slowly. I saw the engine. His voice grew quieter. It looked broken in ways I didn't know machines could break. They break like people do, Sarah replied softly. Push them past limits and something gives. For a while they just stood in silence, watching the aurora shift across the horizon. The world outside the hangar seemed untouched by storms, untouched by fear. But Sarah knew better. Her phone buzzed. A message from Oceanic Airlines, global media requesting statements. Stand by. She sighed, pocketing it. She hadn't even processed her own emotions, yet already the world wanted. David spoke again, his tone thoughtful. You realize what happened tonight isn't just your story anymore. It's everyone. Pilots, passengers, airlines, even industries beyond aviation. People are going to study what you did, not just how you flew, but how you decided, how you led. Sarah looked at him, the glow of aurora reflected in his glasses. I didn't lead, I just acted. That's leadership, he said simply. The words lingered, heavier than any applause in the terminal. Later that night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her body craved rest, but her mind refused. Images replayed. The storm wall flashing white, Jim's trembling hands, Maria's pale face, motionless, passengers whispering in fear. And the sound, the engine dying, its final shudder before silence. She thought of the question Dr. Foster had left hanging. If these storms were growing stronger, if aircraft weren't designed for them, what then? Her phone buzzed again. A news alert. Flight 447's emergency sparks safety review. Investigators examine 777 vulnerabilities. Her chest tightened. Vulnerabilities, plural. This wasn't just her storm anymore. She turned off the phone, letting the darkness swallow the headlines. But the words still pulsed in her mind. What if their ordeal had only been the first warning? Why did the world suddenly know her name? Sarah had spent years slipping through airports unnoticed, one of thousands of uniformed figures passing through terminals, faceless among faceless. But now, only 2 days after Keflavik, her face was splashed across screens from New York to Tokyo. Off-duty pilot saves hundreds. Hero in row 12. She hated the word hero. It sounded like a neat label for something far messier. Heroes didn't wake at 3 a.m. shaking, remembering the shudder of a dying engine. Heroes didn't stare at the ceiling, wondering if their instincts had been luck, not skill. At Keflavik's aviation offices, investigators summoned her again. She entered a sterile conference room, coffee cups lined along the table, maps of the North Atlantic storm pinned to the wall. The Icelandic lead greeted her with a nod. Beside her sat Dr. Foster, the meteorologist, and who carried a folder thick enough to bend. Captain began, "You should know, your flight wasn't the first." Sarah stiffened. "What do you mean?" Pushed forward a sheet of paper. Two other 777s in the last month reported engine anomalies in high-altitude icing. Both returned safely, but the symptoms were similar: temperature spikes, power fluctuations, anti-ice system faults. Sarah's breath caught. "Why haven't I heard about this?" "Because airlines bury near misses," said flatly. "They report them quietly, coded in technical language. Hopping regulators don't connect the dots until someone nearly dies." She looked at Sarah. "Until you." The words felt like a verdict. Dr. Foster added, "The storm you flew through may have accelerated the failure, but the flaw is systemic. A design vulnerability. If icing exceeds limits, the engines choke themselves. The manufacturers know it's rare, but rare isn't never." Sarah leaned back, her pulse quickening. She remembered the vibration in her hands, the way the engine faltered, the whispers of betrayal in every shudder. Not just weather then, weakness buried deep in design. Spread the folder across the table. Photographs, technical diagrams, maintenance logs. "We believe the GE90 engine has a critical vulnerability in extreme icing. Guidance is insufficient, but grounding the fleet would cripple airlines. Billions lost. They'll fight it." Sarah stared at the papers, her throat dry. "So what do you expect from me?" His eyes held hers. "Testimony, public or private. You're the first captain to survive a full shutdown in these conditions. Your voice carries weight." Sarah looked down, her voice, her name. Once she had been anonymous in row 12. Now the weight of fleets rested on her words. Later, at the hotel, she scrolled through her phone. News anchors debated her every move. Talk shows speculated about her background. Some called her a savior. Others criticized Oceanic for allowing an off-duty pilot to sit in row 12 rather than the cockpit jump seat. Her email overflowed, requests for interviews, invitations to conferences. A message from an old squadron mate: "Saw the news, proud of you." She tossed the phone onto the bed, rubbed her face with both hands. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. She hadn't asked to carry an industry's flaws on her shoulders. A knock at the door. David Park again, his presence both steadying and unsettling. He carried a newspaper folded under his arm. "They're calling you the woman who saved 287 souls." Sarah grimaced. Catchy headline. Doesn't change the fact that it was an engine design that almost killed us. He sat across from her, leaning forward. "You're right, but the public doesn't care about design flaws. They care about stories. You're the story, the face they'll listen to." She shook her head. "I didn't sign up for that." David's voice softened. "You didn't sign up to save us either, but you did, and now you're in it whether you like it or not." Silence stretched. Rain tapped against the window. Sarah felt the old ache of responsibility, the same weight she'd carried in cockpits, deployments, missions. She had thought civilian life would ease it, but the truth was, once responsibility chooses you, it never lets go. The next day, Oceanic Airlines held a press conference. Sarah sat stiffly at a table beneath glaring lights, flanked by executives in polished suits. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. "Captain, what was going through your mind during the emergency? Do you believe the 777 is safe to fly? Would you call yourself a hero?" She answered carefully, voice steady but guarded. "I was focused on flying the aircraft. My priority was passengers and crew. As for safety, every aircraft has limits. Our responsibility is to respect them." A reporter pressed, "Do you think should ground the fleet?" Oceanic's spokesperson jumped in, deflecting with polished corporate language. Sarah stayed silent, though her thoughts screamed otherwise. That night called her privately. "They'll bury this if they can, unless someone forces their hand." Sarah stared out the window at Reykjavik's rain-slick streets. And you want me to be that someone? Yes, said simply, because you've already lived it. Sarah's chest tightened. She remembered Jim's trembling hands, Maria's pale face, unconscious, passengers whispering of storming the cockpit. She remembered pressing the PA button, choosing words that kept panic from becoming riot. Every moment burned into her. She also remembered silence, the kind she loved, the anonymity of row 12. Think about it, said, but don't take too long, the next storm won't wait. When the call ended, Sarah sat in darkness. The storm outside the window mirrored the storm inside her. Responsibility pressed against her like cabin pressure. Too much truth could fracture an industry. Too little, and lives would be lost. She whispered into the night, more to herself than anyone. What if I'm not strong enough to carry this? But the silence gave no answer. What does truth sound like in a room full of people who don't want to hear it? Sarah asked herself that as she sat beneath the fluorescent lights of a European Aviation Safety Agency hearing in Brussels. Rows of officials and executives stared at her, their pens poised, their expressions carefully neutral. Cameras recorded every word, every pause, every flicker of hesitation. The chairwoman cleared her throat. Captain, please describe in your own words what you believe caused the failure of Engine 2. Sarah clasped her hands, forcing them to stay still. Extreme icing. Conditions beyond certification standards. The anti-ice system failed to protect the engine, and internal temperatures spiked until the compressor seized. An older man in a gray suit leaned forward. She recognized him. Richard Hall, vice president of engineering. His voice was smooth, practiced. With respect, Captain, the GE90 engine has logged millions of flight hours with an exceptional safety record. Isn't it possible that what you encountered was simply an extraordinary weather event, beyond what any design could anticipate? Sarah met his gaze, unblinking. Extraordinary weather is no longer extraordinary. If these storms are increasing, then your designs are already outdated. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Hall's jaw tightened, but he forced a polite smile. That's speculation, not data. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Data doesn't keep a jet in the sky when engines falter. Judgment does. Instinct does. And if storms are changing faster than data, then judgment is all we have. For a moment the room fell silent. The chairwoman scribbled notes. Reporters in the back tapped furiously on laptops. Sarah felt her heartbeat steady, fueled by the quiet conviction that she wasn't here for applause, she was here for lives. But after the session in the hallway, she heard the whispers. Executives clustering in knots, voices low but urgent. Too much attention. She's overreaching. If she keeps pushing, we'll lose control of the narrative. Sarah walked past them, her shoulders square, her expression unreadable. But inside, the words burrowed. Was she overreaching? Was she becoming a liability rather than a voice of reason? Back at the hotel, Jim knocked on her door. He looked younger than before, though exhaustion still framed his eyes. You were brilliant in there, he said. They didn't like it, but they needed to hear it. Sarah let out a long breath. I don't know if it will matter. Executives have louder voices than captains. Jim shrugged. Maybe, but you landed the plane, they didn't. He lingered in the doorway as though wanting to say more. Finally, he added, whatever happens, I'm glad it was you in that cockpit. Anyone else, we wouldn't be here. Sarah gave a small nod, a rare softness touching her features. His words mattered more than any applause in a terminal. Later that evening, Maria joined them in the hotel lounge, her uniform pressed but her spirit worn. She sipped tea, her hands trembling slightly. Passengers are still contacting me. Some of them are struggling. Panic attacks, nightmares. One mother said her son refuses to board another plane. Her eyes flicked up at Sarah. They look to you for reassurance, for answers. Sarah stared into her own untouched glass. I'm not sure I have answers. Maria leaned closer, her voice firmer. Then give them honesty. That's more than most people in this industry ever do. The words settled in Sarah's chest like a quiet truth. Honesty wasn't always clean or easy or welcome, but it was all she had. The next morning she received an envelope slid under her hotel door. No name, no address. Inside, a single sheet of paper, a maintenance log from Oceanic Airlines dated 2 weeks before their flight. Engine 2 inspection. Notes scribbled in the margin, de-ice sensor intermittent, deferred until next cycle. Her stomach twisted. Deferred, not repaired. The same engine that had failed them over the Atlantic had already been flagged. She scanned the log again and again, her pulse pounding. If this was true, then it wasn't only storms and flawed design. It was negligence. Someone had known and someone had decided to wait. She tucked the log into her bag, heart racing. Who had sent it? Why? The envelope had no markings, no fingerprints she could see, a warning or a threat. At the next hearing, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Executives droned on about statistical anomalies and robust safeguards. Regulators debated wording. But Sarah's mind burned with the single phrase, deferred until next cycle. Afterward, she confronted privately. If I show you something off the record, can you keep it safe? His eyes narrowed. Depends what it is. She handed him the log. His brow furrowed as he read. Then his expression darkened. If this is authentic, it changes everything. It means the failure wasn't just nature or design. It was maintenance oversight. Sarah crossed her arms, her voice low. More than oversight, it was a choice. Nodded grimly. You need to be careful, Captain. If this gets out, there will be people who don't want you speaking anymore. The words chilled her. She wasn't. She knew industries protected themselves, sometimes ruthlessly, but hearing it spoken aloud made the threat feel close, real. That night in her room, she found herself staring at the door, half expecting another envelope, half expecting something worse. Her phone buzzed. A message from David Park, we're with you. Don't let them silence this. She set the phone down, staring at the city lights through the rain-speckled glass. She had wanted anonymity. Row 12, quiet, forgotten. But fate had pulled her forward again and again. And now, with secrets surfacing, she realized something terrifying. The storm had ended. The landing was behind her, but the real turbulence, political, corporate, moral, was only beginning. What happens when the story that saved you is twisted into one that destroys you? Sarah found out 3 days later, sitting alone in a quiet in Brussels. Her coffee had gone cold by the time she saw the headline on a glowing television mounted on the wall. Captain's recklessness questioned. Did heroism cross the line? Her stomach dropped. The anchor's voice was calm, almost soothing, as he read words meant to slice her apart. Anonymous airline sources suggest Captain Sarah may have overstepped her authority, taking control of a cockpit she wasn't assigned to. Some are asking, did her interference put passengers at further risk? There was silence, but she felt eyes on her, strangers glancing from the screen to her face, whispering. Her hands clenched around the cup until it trembled. She left quickly, rain slicking her hair as she stepped into the street. Back in her hotel room, she turned on her phone. Notifications poured in, mentions, messages, speculation, some supportive, others venomous. Stay in row 12 where you belong, attention seeker. If you were that good, why weren't you captain already? She dropped the phone on the bed, pressing her palms against her eyes. The memory of the storm, the silence of a dying engine, the pale face of they were real, unshakable. Yet here, in this world of headlines and spin, truth was already dissolving. A knock at the door. Jim stood there, jaw tight, phone in hand. You've seen it. She nodded. They're painting you as reckless. He shook his head. Unbelievable. Without you, we'd all be in the Atlantic. Sarah exhaled slowly. Executives are behind it. They want me silenced. If they can tarnish me, they can bury the maintenance logs. Jim lowered his voice. The log you showed. Yes, and if there are more like it. There are, Jim interrupted. His eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway before he shut the door behind him. I called a friend in maintenance, quietly. He says deferred fixes are routine. Not one plane, dozens, maybe hundreds. Airlines push them to keep schedules. Engines flagged for ice sensors, turbine wear, pressure fluctuations deferred until next cycle, always next cycle. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine. Deferred. A word that meant nothing in a boardroom but everything in a storm. Maria joined them an hour later, face pale, shoulders squared. She carried a folder under her arm. Passenger statements, she said. Letters, emails. They're coming together supporting you. They know what you did up there. She placed the folder on the table, but her hands lingered on it. But there's something else. A man approached me after the hearing, said he worked in corporate safety. He warned me to be careful, said you're making enemies in high places. Sarah's eyes hardened. Good, it means we're close to the truth. Maria shook her head. Close to danger, Sarah, there's a difference. That night Sarah barely slept. She dreamed of the cockpit, alarms screaming, ice crusting across metal, slumped Jim's trembling hands. She woke at dawn, sweat soaking the sheets. The storm still lived in her, as if the landing hadn't ended it. Later that day, Oceanic executives summoned her to a private meeting in a glass tower overlooking Brussels. The office gleamed, marble floors, polished steel, the smell of money and power. Captain, said a man in a tailored suit, his voice dripping with false warmth. We appreciate your service, truly, but the narrative in the media has become complicated. For everyone's sake, perhaps it's best you step back, return home, let the professionals handle the investigation. Sarah's jaw tightened. What do you mean by step back? Another executive, a woman with sharp eyes, interjected. Your continued involvement only fuels speculation. If you withdraw, the story will fade. That's best for the airline, for the industry, and for you. Sarah studied them, her silence louder than their words. They wanted her gone, erased, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. I can't step back, she said finally, her voice steady. Not when lives are at stake. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile. Lives are always at stake in aviation. That's why stability matters more than noise. They dismissed her politely, but the message was clear. Silence or exile. Walking back through the rain, Sarah felt the weight of her choice pressing harder. She could still vanish, go back to anonymity, slip into row 12 and disappear. But then she saw his face in her mind. The man carried off on a stretcher, still unconscious, still fighting for life. And the passengers, David Park, the terrified mother, the boy who couldn't stop crying. All of them alive because she hadn't stayed silent. By the time she returned to the hotel, her decision was firm. Jim looked at her, reading her expression. You're not backing down. No, she said simply. Maria's voice wavered. Then you need to be ready, they'll come harder now. Smear campaigns may be worse. Sarah sat heavily, staring out at the rain-soaked city. They can attack me, but they can't erase what happened at 40,000 feet. Silence stretched. Then Jim said quietly, so what's the plan? Sarah turned back to them, eyes sharp, voice low. We find every log, every deferred repair. We show the world this isn't about one storm or one flight. It's about an entire system gambling with lives. Her words hung in the room like a vow. Outside, thunder rumbled over Brussels, not the kind from a storm, but the echo of conflict building. Sarah knew what it meant. The storm wasn't behind her anymore. It was ahead, and this time it wasn't in the skis. What would you sacrifice for truth? That question had haunted Sarah since the moment the engines fell silent over the Atlantic. She had survived storms, corporate pressure, media smears, but now the decision pressed harder than ever. It came in the form of a sealed envelope slid under her hotel door in Brussels. Inside, a stack of maintenance logs, dozens of them, different aircraft, different routes, different crews. But the same phrase again and again, scrawled in technician shorthand. De-ice sensor intermittent. Deferred until next cycle. Her breath caught. This wasn't one oversight. It was a pattern, a culture. Deferred safety in the name of profit, repeated until inevitability turned into disaster waiting for a clock to strike. She sat on the edge of her bed, the papers spread across her lap like confessions. The storm had not been the only enemy. The real enemy wore suits and smiled in press conferences. Her phone buzzed. A message from board hearing tomorrow. They'll want your statement. Decide carefully. Carefully, she almost laughed, as if care had saved them at 40,000 feet. No, what saved them was courage, instinct, and refusal to surrender. The next morning, the hall was packed. Officials, executives, journalists, passengers from Flight 447, all gathered under the gleam of chandeliers. The air buzzed with anticipation, tension coiled like wire. Sarah sat at the front table, microphone before her, the weight of the world pressing against her chest. Jim sat behind her, Maria at his side. David Park, too, his eyes steady, quiet faith written on his face. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Captain, we invite you to speak. Tell us what must be understood." Sarah looked down at the papers in her hands. Pages of deferred maintenance, silent warnings ignored. She thought of, still recovering in a hospital bed. She thought of the boy who cried the whole descent, the mother clutching his shoulders, Maria whispering calm into chaos. She thought of the applause in the terminal, the headlines calling her hero, the smears branding her reckless. Her heart pounded, silence stretched, and then she began. "I wasn't supposed to be in that cockpit," she said softly. "I was in row 12, anonymous, a passenger like everyone else. But when the captain collapsed and the storm closed around us, anonymity wasn't an option anymore. I stepped forward, not because I wanted to, but because there was no one else." Her voice grew steadier. "We didn't just face a storm. We faced a machine unprepared for it. And more than that, we faced a system that knew its flaws and chose silence." Gasps rippled through the audience. Executives shifted uncomfortably, their polished masks cracking. Sarah held up the logs. "These aren't hypotheticals. These are real aircraft, real inspections. Engines flagged for the same vulnerability that nearly killed us. Deferred. Again and again. Deferred until when? Until another crew prays for instinct to save them. Until another mother tells her child it will be all right, when it won't be." The chairwoman raised a hand, attempting order, but Sarah's voice carried now, not loud but undeniable. "Flying isn't about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about lives. Passengers trust us not just with tickets and luggage, but with everything they are. That trust is sacred. And when we trade it for schedules and profits, we betray more than safety. We betray humanity itself." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "I'm not here for recognition. I don't need applause. I'm here because silence would make me complicit, and I refuse." She placed the logs on the table. The sound echoed in the chamber, heavier than thunder. For a long moment there was only silence. Then voices erupted, reporters shouting questions, officials whispering fiercely, executives scrambling to control the narrative. But the truth was already loose, alive in the room. Later outside, Sarah stood on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward her. She didn't answer them. She didn't need to. The words she'd spoken inside would ripple far beyond Brussels. Jim joined her, his hand briefly resting on her shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. Maria added, tears in her eyes, "You gave us all a voice." David Park simply nodded. "Sometimes the hardest storms aren't in the sky. You weathered this one." Sarah gazed upward, the clouds parting, faint sunlight breaking through. She thought of the storm's roar, the silence after the engine died, the applause she had never wanted. And now this. She walked away from the cameras, her steps steady, her face calm. She didn't know what her future held, whether airlines would shun her, whether executives would bury her career. But she knew one thing with clarity. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And in that truth she found peace.